Hey, everybody, hope you all are doing well and welcome back. And as we continue our trip through Europe, and pretty much kind of like cats who come back to your door night after night because you keep feeding them, well, we are back in London doing another amazing flight of tastings of whiskeys. And this time it is from the Weller family. So we can try the Weller 107, the Full Proof, the Weller 12, the CYPB, and the Single Barrel all side by side. So I think this one's going to be a really interesting family tasting. Now, before we get to it, if you like these videos, if you like the wanders, if you like the hauls, the reviews, the unbottlings, the unboxings, and really all the amazing stuff we got cooking up for you, and we have tons of amazing stuff cooking up for you, don't forget to like and subscribe because it really does help the channel to grow, and you get notifications when our newest videos come out. For now, down to the video. All right, so let's get to our real quick whiskey check, and I think today we're going to try something that is in the family of Buffalo Trace, so a distant cousin to the Weller, which is this Eagle Rare 10, and it's something that I really, really enjoy. So let's get that and get a glass, and get a pop. Let's see if we can get a pop here. It's okay. Get a little juice. Oh, yeah. And whiskey, because let's face it, you can never really drink too much of it. You can only just drink it too fast. Cheers. All right, so first up to bat in this tasting is going to be the Weller 107, or the Antique Weller, which I have a bottle here. It is the red one, as you can tell. It's actually a pretty cool looking bottle. I really like the red and the gold. I've always loved that contrast. Now, it's called the Antique Weller because of the fact that it is reminiscent of the original recipe that William Weller used for some of his first wheated bourbons. Now, just real quick, the Weller line has gained a huge amount of popularity recently because it's one of the earliest adopters of whiskeys that are, of course, corn-based, but also use wheat as an alternate grain in the mash bill rather than the more popular rye. Initially, with the whiskey boom and all the newcomers to serious whiskey drinking, myself included, Weller has exploded in popularity because of its proximity to the Van Winkle line of bourbons. I guess you would definitely call them cousins for sure, right? Because they are both in the Buffalo Trace distillery. They both kind of are housed in the same warehouses, maybe, perhaps. But they also use the same mash bill. But you know what? They do differ pretty dramatically in price, in rarity, and also how they're stored in the barrels they they are aged in. Now, the Antique 107, as you would think, has an ABV of 53.5%. You can see that there. And it doesn't have an age statement on it, but allegedly it is aged a minimum of 7 years and uses the Buffalo Trace wheated mash bill. The tasting notes that we had on it when we tried it is that from the very beginning, it was super enjoyable and very approachable, considering the ABV is on the higher side, especially for the wife. And despite the ABV being kind of higher, it did feel very well balanced. And additionally, we got a strong sweetness, best described as brown sugar, cinnamon, and not corny at all, and a viscosity that would be considered medium bodied. The one thing that did kind of fall short on it was the finish. Finish felt, I guess you call it medium length, with a noticeable but not overpowering char. So for this one, I really did like this. Actually, both of us really liked this one, and especially in retrospect, after trying all the other Wellers in the flight, this one really did get a lot better, especially in comparison to some of the other ones. I like that the ABV is high, as well as the fact that it is well balanced, so it's not off kilter. And so, yeah, we ended up putting this one at the number 2 of our favorite out of the flight. So obviously this one is a buy, and we are going to do a tasting, a side-by-side with some of the other ones of this one here in the not-so-distant future. But if you can find it at a MSRP or even kind of thereabouts, it's definitely worth a buy. So I would recommend picking this one up for sure. All right, so that's the Weller Antique 107. All right, so next up, we move on to the Weller Single Barrel, which is one of the newer additions to the Weller lineup. And as it sounds, it's a single barrel variety of the Weller family. One thing that I disliked about it right up front was just that, from a record-keeping point of view, it doesn't have a barrel number on it, so you can't really collect all the different ones like you could do with Stag Junior or maybe some of the Michters, and then compare them one against the other. So that's kind of a bummer. But presumably because of its single barreledness and its uniqueness of each barrel, This one I would say is probably kind of the quirkier brother within the family. There is unfortunately no age statement on it either, but it is an annual release and it is ABV'd at a lower percentage than the 107 at 48.5%. Now, of course, it is the same wheated mash bill as the other Wellers, and it feels like this one was launched primarily in response to the massive recent popularity that Weller and bourbon writ large has experienced. So, I'm not calling it a money grab, but it's kind of a money grab. Now, upon tasting this one, the wife and I found that it was less to our liking than the Antique 107. The tasting notes that we had on it mentioned things like the nose really has a strong scent of cotton candy flavor, which is nice. That was very enticing. But when we actually tried it, it does seem a bit off balance. I guess this could be just as, this one single barrel is that way. So I don't want to label all of them that way. But that's the chance you always take with a single barrel. The ABV on it, I would describe it as overrepresented in the flavor palette. And it sort of drowned out all the other flavors that come with Weller that are really enjoyable. So things like vanilla and sweetness. And in fact, those flavors kind of tasted a little bit watery. Lastly, and the most noticeable thing aside from the ABV is the fact that there was much, much, much more char bitterness in each sip than what we had gotten at the 107, and really, I think, from any of the other Wellers. So for us, I think this single barrel is it's going to actually be at the bottom of our list at number 5 out of all the Wellers that we had tried. It just seems thin, unbalanced, and a little more charry than I would have liked. So again, if you can find it at a reasonable price for me, this is one that I would still buy because, well, we don't have it in our collection yet. And of course, it has its own merits to be able to be a part of the collection. But if it was on its own flavor palette, I think I would just pass. All right, so next up in the line is probably one of the most famous and the most highly sought after of the Wellers, which is this Weller 12. And this one specifically, we had actually got last year in Paris, not in London, because unfortunately they didn't have any. But that is why this one specifically is the 700 milliliter version, which is always kind of a sticking point. But you know what? You got to get it when you can get it because it's quite difficult to find. This one is also the oldest age statement of the Wellers in the normal Weller line that is available. And as per usual, at this point, it has the same mash bill as the other 3 that we try. So the unique attribute on this one, really most honestly, is the fact that it has an age statement of 12 years, which means that it is older than the other 2 that we had tried up to this point, and maybe even as much by like 3 or 4 years. But again, it is the same juice, it is the same mash bill, and presumably it's in the same barrels in the same warehouse. So it's interesting to see exactly how those extra couple of years can mellow out and mature out the flavor on it. Also, I am not sure why, but the ABV on this one is at 45%, which I guess you would call is more of a traditional ABV for a bourbon, kind of an old-timey level. And it is actually the lowest of the bunch. Now, the tasting notes that we had on the Weller 12 were that there was a lot of mellow maturity that was instantly evident. It was not as sweet as the 107, but it had much deeper barrel flavor and very, very well-balanced ABV and flavor palette, which is super nice. And I think that just maybe that aging and the mellowing that comes along with it, it really does allow for a large cornucopia of nuances within the whiskey to shine a lot more than what you would get with the 107, who, his main features are going to be ABV and the counterbalancing sweetness that goes with it. Like it's so dialed up to the point that all the underlying complexities, if there are any, get shouted over. Now, in comparison to the single barrel, I think that much of that thin, watery flavor that was in the single barrel are much more defined as well as pronounced in this Weller 12. There's a bit of bitterness with a much, much shorter than expected finish, which is kind of a bit of a disappointment. We really did expect much more on the finish than we got with this, legendary Weller 12. So for this one, I really did enjoy it, and I would actually put it at the number 1 on our favorite list from the tasting. And of course, there are things that are left to be desired about it, like the finish. But in the moment, in the opening salvos of each of the tastes that go along with the Weller 12, it's exactly where I'd want to be. So this one is definitely a buy whenever you can find it. even if it is, of course, if it's at a mythical MSRP price, but even if it's a little bit higher, it's definitely worth a buy. So that's the Weller 12. All right, so the number 4 whiskey that we tried in this Weller flight was one that I had super duper duper high hopes for. It just gets so much hype that even in comparison to the other Wellers, it gets a lot of hype, which is the CYPB. This one is created basically by a crowdfunding effort by Weller that allowed bourbon lovers to go online and select from a variety of options to create their perfect bourbon. So, like where it would be housed in the warehouse, or what the ABV should be, or how long it should be aged, and all these other criteria. And they took that information and Weller created this CYPB. Now, the thing is, I definitely trust my fellow bourbon drinkers to vote accurately, especially on things like who should be holding the keys to the nuclear arsenal. But when it comes to making bourbon crowdsourced, that's when I'm not so sure it's such a great idea. Now, CYPB is ABV'd at 47.5%. So it is kind of a high to maybe like mid-range ABV for the Weller line. It doesn't have an age statement on it, but it is purportedly aged a minimum of 8 years. And after it was added in 2018, it has become a yearly allocated release that is starting to be almost as hard to find as some of the BTAC lines, or even the paterfamilias of the Weller line, the William LaRue Weller. When we tried it, I'll be upfront with you and say that we were not impressed. In fact, this one is going to go at the very bottom of the list of our favorites from the tasting. That being said, the CYPB seems to have a very light touch to it in the sense that it really seems to mimic the same profile that you got out of the single barrel, and it lacks the kind of depth that you get out of the 12, and it has an outsized ABV burn considering the ABV is still pretty low. But the upside to it is that you get much more barrel flavor than pretty much any of the other Wellers in the tasting that we did, and to its credit, the finish is sturdy and long, which is something that is missing from all the other Wellers. But it is that wateriness and that unbalanced ABV that really ended up turning us off. So for the CYPB, it is going to be at the bottom of the list. Not all the way to the bottom. Put at number 4 of our favorites. If we could get the 12, though, with the length and sturdiness of the finish on the CYPB, that would be my perfect bourbon. But alas, sigh, cannot. So this one is another one that I would still buy to have in the collection, to be able to compare and contrast with the other bourbons and the other Wellers. But it wouldn't be something that I would often reach for if there was an occasion to drink a high-end bourbon, if that ever does arise. So I would buy it to have a part of the collection, but again, it's just something to be a part of the collection and be able to compare and contrast. All right, last and not least is another relative newcomer to the Weller line, which is the Weller Foolproof. Now, the Foolproof, despite what it sounds, is actually not at barrel proof. Rather, it is the proof that the Weller is when it is put into the barrel, rather than what it is when it comes out of the barrel. So they get a little sneaky there. But it's supposed to be the most gregarious of the Weller family. Think of the friendly uncle, I guess, or the loud and boisterous uncle. And I think that it's really filled that role out quite well from when we tasted it. It's ABV'd at 57%, which is the highest ABV in the line. And although it doesn't have an age statement on it like the other Wellers, it is likely aged between 6 and 8 years. It was introduced in 2019 and is another super highly allocated yearly release that is ending up to be, again, rarer than hen's teeth. So finding it is always going to be a little bit of a struggle. Tasting notes that we had on it was that it was surprisingly light on the nose. There isn't a strong nose on it, but when we took our first sip, there was a very powerful ABV kick, which is something that I really liked. The wife caught her off guard, but it's something that I really like. And I think that it really is a much better ABV for the contemporary palate and maybe some of the new bourbon drinkers than maybe the Antique 107 or even the 12, which do end up being a little underpowered. Now, that being said, it does have a similar problem that you get with the 107, that it really kind of lacks a lot of personality. Its ABV and higher proof means that it doesn't really have to develop any kind of complexity that can seduce wayward bourbon drinkers like myself. They, of course, are the typical Weller family profile of balance and counterbalance of ABV and outright sweetness. But again, it doesn't really have a lot of complexity to it. So all in all, the Weller Foolproof comes in at our number 3 out of 5 out of the flight. And I really do enjoy the fact that it has a higher ABV. And again, if we can get the 12 with the higher ABV at 57% and the longer finish, that would be ideal, even if it costs a couple extra bucks. But if you set that aspect aside, you know, the foolproof is really not that impressive. But ultimately, this one would also be a buy. Yes, I definitely would buy it because, well, frankly, I think that if you are going to do a night where you're drinking through all the Wellers, this one is going to be the anchor because it has the highest ABV. It means that you can kind of finish with a little bit of a bang going through the entire line because, going through the entire line and then going back down to 45% with the Weller 12 would just not be a great way to finish the night. All right, so that's it for our tasting of the Flight of Weller that we did during our trip to London. We found that, it's not always the highest age or the highest ABV that makes the best whiskey, but rather it is a combination of the many factors that make a beautiful palate and ultimately make bourbon and art more than just a simple science. So I hope you enjoyed this video of the tastings, and if you did, if you like the reviews and the wanders and the hauls and the unbottlings and the unboxings and really all the cool stuff we're doing, we've got tons of cool stuff. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It really, again, does help our channel to grow. It's great for your whiskey mojo, and you get notifications when our newest videos come out on Sundays and sometimes in between. Now remember, if you do find a whiskey that you love, just buy it. Because if you don't, somebody else surely will. And in this case, it might even be me. All right, everybody. I hope you all have a great rest of your week. I'm out, and adios.